let's do a quick example just to show command line arguments as well as deal with strings, and we'll learn something new in this video as well, which is how do we deal with strings and how do we make them into numbers. Now here we're just going to do a very simple example. All we're going to do is write a program that takes two command line arguments, and those two command line arguments are both going to be integers, and then we're going to print the sum of those two numbers and then the product of those two numbers. So for instance, if my command line arguments were 3 and 4, I'm going to print 7 because 3 plus 4 is 7, and then 12 because 3 times 4 is 12. So first things first, what I'm going to do here, because we're going to be using command line arguments and I'm going to be using numbers, what you'll need to include is a library called the C standard library, or stdlib. This one is going to contain functions called a2i and a2f, so we'll just say includes a2i, and that's the one we're going to be using, and I'll explain it once we get to it. Now remember, if we want to do command line arguments, which is when we type in commands as we run the program, then the way we have to do that is we need to include some arguments in main for it to be able to recognize that. The first one is called argc, which, if you remember, is the argument count. It tells us how many arguments there are. And the second one is a char star star called argv, which is the argument vector and holds all of the arguments that we want. Okay, so now we should actually be able to access the arguments. First things first, just for the sake of our debugging, let's print out how many arguments we have. So we'll say the argument count is, and then we'll simply print it. Remember that this is always at least 1. So by default, and I don't really think there's a way to avoid this, the first argument is always the program that you're using to run, or specifically the program name. So if I run this, the argument count, if I don't type anything, will be 1, and the first argument, which is argument 0, is going to be the argument that is the name of my executable. Let's go into how to actually read in the arguments now. They're going to be stored in the argument vector. So when you first run the program, the argument vector gets set with whatever you type in. Here we want 2 arguments, so we're going to want the first argument is going to be the program name, and then we want the 2 arguments after that to be the 2 numbers that we're going to add or multiply. So if I was to run this, then it might look like example run ./a.out, and then we'll just say 3 and 4. So my run might look something like this, and when we actually run it, I'll try it with this. The argument 0 is this, it will be the ./a.out, the argument 1 will be 3, and the argument 2 will be 4. So if I want to be able to get the 3, the way I'll have to do it is with argv. Remember, we use these square braces to access things that hold multiple values, and I want the first value, that will be 3. So this will get the first number, and we want to actually do something with it. So for the time being, just for practice, let's say I do string. So something to consider, it says char star star, and because a string holds a bunch of characters, these are essentially equivalent. So I will be able to hold something into argv if I do this. So I'm going to create a string called first number string, and I'll set it equal to argv1, and I will do a second one here called second number string, and I'll set it equal to 2. Now if you remember from the string video, if you've happened to watch that yet, then a string is just a collection of characters, right? So for instance, this is a string right here, right? It's the message, the argument count is, and then a space. So whenever I get anything that is a command line argument, it is always a string. Even though I'm typing in numbers here, they are going to be the string representation of it. So rather than this being the number 3, it's going to be equivalent to me writing down the number 3 kind of like on a piece of paper, whereas it's the symbolic representation of it and not the actual number itself. And the same thing goes for the 4. So if I was to try and add argv1 and argv2, or first number string and second number string here, what we would actually see is 34 and not 3 and 4, or 7, right? If what 3 plus 4 is actually equal to. So this is kind of like, that middle school joke people make, right? If you take 3 plus 4, you get 34 and not, 7. Is if you add strings together, all you're going to do is simply take the characters, the symbolic representation, and just append them together. So what we'll need to do is convert these first to integers so that we can add them like they're normal numbers. The way we do that in C++, at least the easiest way, is with a function called a2i, which is why I included the C standard library. Now a, for some reason, they used for string. I'm not entirely sure what it stands for. It might be array. Array to integer is what this means, I believe. So the a is array, and then the word to, and then integer. So it converts a string, which is a type of array, again we'll get to that in a later lecture, to an integer. So here I'll say first number, we'll call it that, is equal to a2i first number string, and then I will do the same thing. I'll make a second number here, and I will convert it. So I realize that there's an issue with it not liking strings being directly put into the a2i argument here, and there's a way we could fix this pretty easily, but I think it's a little beyond the scope of this class, so I'm just going to, for the sake of making this make sense, I'm going to simply put argv1 here, and that should work. So just for a comment, so nobody gets confused, this is just for example. We're not using either of these anywhere in our code for anything that means anything, so these are just for an example. Now this converts the first number from a string to a integer, and this one here does the same thing with the second number. So what this will do, this first line, for instance, if I ran it with 3 and 4, this first one is going to get 3, which is argv1, because it's the first argument. The a.out is the 0th argument. It's going to take that 3 as a string, it's going to convert it to an integer, and then it's going to store it in first number. And this second line is going to do the same thing, but with 4. Now if I want to just print the output of these, let's do that really quick. So we'll say cout, we'll put first number, and then I'll simply put plus second number equals, and then we'll put the addition of these two things. I need to put number after that. Okay, and then we'll just do the same thing down here, except we'll do it with multiplication. And now, just so I'm not doing in Visual Studio, I'm going to go ahead and copy this over to Sally, and we're going to run it there. Okay, now I'm on Sally. I went ahead and copied this over, so let's go ahead and change into my CS135 directory, which I have to case correctly. ls, and we have the CPP file right here. It's called user input and strings example.cpp. I'm simply going to compile that with G++. User, I'll hit tab to make it autocomplete, enter, and then we can now run it, right? So it'll be /a.out. Now if I was to just run this normally, I think it will give us an error. It says core dumped, and the reason it does that is because it didn't enter anything for the command line argument, so when it goes to do something like argv1, it's going to have an issue converting that, and specifically this line I think is what caused is a core dump, because it's going to try to convert something that's just random garbage because there's no argv1 because I didn't type one, and it will give me a core dump. So just be careful if you mean to type command line arguments that you're actually typing them. We'll get into how you can avoid people not typing them and fix that later in one of the future videos, but for now we'll just see this. So I forgot to put an end line, but you see that it says the argument count is 3 and then there's no space after it. So really quick, let's just throw an end line in there, and I will remove it over really quick. Okay, so I moved it back over. Let's go ahead and compile, and we will run again, and we see the argument count is 3, which was what we expected. So the first argument is a.out, or /a.out. The second argument is 3, and the third argument is 4. And then you see it correctly got the numbers 3 and 4, and now we can actually add them together and multiply. Let's zoom in a little bit just so this is more obvious. But you'll see that it runs perfectly fine. So here, this was just an example of more stuff with how to use command line arguments, and then also just consider when you do a command line argument, everything is always a string, whereas if you do a cin, it will actually already convert these for you. So if you're doing a command line argument, you have to convert things to whatever data type you want. Here we use a to I because we want an integer, but other functions exist for this too, like a to f is also in C standard library, and that will convert an array to a float, for instance, would be one example. Anyways, I think that about does it. Hopefully this example helps a little bit, and it will be available on Canvas.